Welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to stop by today. So my hope for today's video is to clarify some of the misinformation that is out there on YouTube, particularly in the Watts case, regarding autopsy, the determination of time of death, the process of death investigation, and the post-mortem changes in a deceased person's body. So I'd like to give you a warning that this is graphic in nature. And so if you are sensitive to those kind of things, I do not recommend that you watch this video. So let's first talk about what a coroner is. Coroners, we speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Coroners investigate all deaths in their jurisdiction that are unattended by a physician and or are the result of any sudden, suspicious, or violent incident. So the coroner has complete jurisdiction over the body of the deceased, and it is the coroner's responsibility to confirm the victim's identity. So immediately upon arrival on scene, a coroner will pronounce the deceased and give law enforcement a time of death. The coroner's responsibility is to determine at that time the initial cause and manner of the person's death. So let me explain the difference. A cause of death is the specific injury or disease that led to the person's death. And the manner of death is the determination of how the injury or disease led to the person's death. And there are 5 manners of death. There's natural death, accident, suicide, homicide, and undetermined. So once the coroner determines an initial cause and manner of death, the coroner will order or request other special investigative personnel to respond on scene. And this would be detectives, homicide detectives, or the NTSB if it's an airline accident, or OSHA if it's work-related, or Homeland Security, the FBI, those kind of things. So the coroner is the one that kicks off those investigations. So once the coroner has issued a time of death, the coroner will photograph the deceased, interview the witnesses if there are any on scene, interview the law enforcement personnel that's on the scene, and try to find information that would lead to identifying who this person is. And if that is not possible, then the coroner will request or order further testing, such as DNA analysis, fingerprinting. We identify by dental records, things like that. So after the coroner finishes with the on-scene investigation, the next step is to authorize and supervise the removal of the deceased body and ensuring that there's no contamination or any destruction of evidence in the process. The coroner will collect the victim's valuables that are found on the body or in the clothing, and the coroner will arrange for transportation of the body to the morgue. Next, when the coroner finally clears the scene, as quickly as possible, the coroner will make notification to the next of kin. And if it's local, they will notify in person. But if it's geographically not possible, then the coroner will notify the next of kin by telephone. So at this point in the investigation, the death investigation, the coroner has made a preliminary determination of the cause and manner of death. The coroner has secured any supporting agencies that are required, hopefully identified the victim, and made notification of next of kin. And next, the coroner will return to the morgue. And then the body will be fingerprinted, weighed, clothing removed, photographs are taken again, and the deceased will be placed in the cooler to await autopsy. Next, the coroner will complete a detailed report of the on-scene investigation and findings, and this report will be reviewed the following morning with the medical examiner prior to autopsy. Now, time of death seems to be a very simple and straightforward term, and most people think it is the exact time that the victim drew their last breath. But unfortunately, that's not that simple to do. So time of death is also referred to as the post-mortem interval, which is the time that has elapsed between the time the person drew their last breath till the time the coroner lays eyes on the deceased. So it's not as an exact science as it is portrayed in the movies or on TV. So let's look at the differences in time of death. There are the actual physiological death, which is when the vital functions of the person have actually ceased. There's also the time of death that the coroner assigns once the coroner arrives on scene and gives to law enforcement. And then there's also the time of death that is recorded on the death certificate. So it can be quite confusing to people who are not familiar or in the field of death investigation. Now, a coroner, we have things that we use to help us better determine time of death. And we do that by observing changes in the deceased body. So let me go through some of those with you and try to help you understand time of death regarding the changes that we see. So if it's between 1 to 2 hours after the person has died, we will start to see early signs of what we call lividity. And I'll describe that in a little bit. 2 to 5 hours after death, there will be clear signs of lividity throughout the person's body. 2 to 7 hours after death, rigor mortis will begin. The process of rigor mortis sets in. Within 8 to 12 hours after death, rigor mortis will be established throughout the person's body, including their extremities, the arms and legs. Now, about 12 hours after death, the body will have cooled to about 77 degrees Fahrenheit internally. About 20 to 24 hours after death, the body will have cooled to the surrounding temperature. Approximately 24 hours after death as well, rigor mortis will begin to disappear from the body in roughly the same order as it appeared. And I'll explain that in a minute. 36 hours after death, rigor mortis will have completely disappeared from the body. And 48 hours after death, we will start to see body discoloration, and clear signs of decomposition will begin at approximately 48 hours. So let's talk about autopsy for a minute. The word autopsy is Latin, and it means seeing with one's own eyes. There are 4 stages of post-mortem death. stages after death. And those are pallor mortis, algor mortis, livor mortis, and rigor mortis. Most people are familiar with the term rigor mortis, but they don't necessarily know that there are 3 other stages. So the first is pallor mortis, and Latin, pallor means paleness, and mortis means death. The word means death. So it is the very first stage of death. And so it's an after-death paleness that occurs in light-skinned people that we can see. If the person is not light-skinned, we can measure. There's a device called an optoelectronical color measurement device that helps us to measure pallor mortis on a person's body. The next is algor mortis, and algor mortis is also Latin, and it translates to the words cold death. It is the cooling of the body after death, and it continues for about 6 hours after a person dies. You see, normal body temperature is maintained by the blood circulating. So when the heart stops, circulation stops, and the body begins to cool, and the body's temperature slowly will approach the ambient temperature in the environment. So it takes around 12 hours for a human body to be cool to the touch, and 24 hours to be cool to the internal core. So of all the methods that we use to determine time of death, body temperature is probably the least reliable because of a number of factors that will affect it. For example, the body dimensions, the clothing that the deceased is wearing, the ambient temperature in the environment, the air movement around the body. In the Watts case, on the morning of August 13th, 2018, at approximately 7 a.m., it was 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and it got up to a high of 86. So that would definitely affect the body temperature, how fast or how slowly it's cooling. The next is lividity, and it's called livor mortis, and that is the settling of blood due to gravity. So the pooling of blood is a process based on the loss of blood pressure when the heart stops beating. And so it occurs at the same rate despite the temperature in the environment. So livor mortis starts to develop within 2 to 4 hours after death. And it becomes non-fixed, or what we call blanchable, up to 8 to 12 hours after death. And then it becomes fixed or non-blanchable after 8 to 12 hours from the time of death. So to determine if a body is blanching or not, a coroner will press their finger in an area of pooled blood to see if the area is fixed or not, so that they can use that as another way to help determine the time of death. Now, lividity does not provide us with a very precise measurement as well after about 12 hours after death. So it is not very helpful with bodies that are found days or weeks or months after death. It's only really helpful up to 12 hours after death. So next is rigor mortis. So we've heard a lot about rigor mortis. It settles in approximately 2 to 6 hours after death and can last up to 36 hours. And what it is exactly is that immediately after death, all of our muscles in our body will relax, And rigor mortis is the process in which the muscles will become stiff and unpliable. The muscles tense up due to a buildup of acid in the muscle tissues. So when rigor mortis goes through its cycle and is released, then the muscles become limp again and pliable. So rigor typically starts in the small muscles of the eyelids, actually, approximately 1 to 2 hours after death. And next, rigor progresses to the muscles of the lower jaw, the neck, the face muscles, and then it moves to your chest. Next, the upper extremities, then the trunk of your body, and then the lower extremities. And the last muscles to be affected are the fingers and toes. So the nature of the gradual development of rigor, the order of the progress of rigor, and the ultimate disappearance give rigor mortis some very striking characteristics. And the disappearance of rigor mortis is the same as the order of appearance. So, for instance, it starts in the eyelids, then it will release in the eyelids first, okay? So the disappearance of rigor mortis is denoted by the flaccidity of the muscles, and it is caused by the action of alkaline liquids produced by the process of putrefaction. So to give you an idea of how it would present, here's how we can tell. If the body feels warm and there is no rigor mortis present whatsoever, then we can approximate that the death has occurred under 3 hours. If the body feels warm and stiff, then typically the death occurred 3 to 8 hours previously. If the body is cold and stiff, then the death occurred between 8 and 36 hours previously. And if the body is cold and not stiff, then we know that the death likely occurred more than 36 hours earlier. So the use of rigor mortis as a time of death indicator is less than reliable because of the large span of time that it encompasses. And there are also factors that will impact the onset of rigor mortis and the timeline of rigor mortis. For instance, the temperature in the environment, whether or not the person was ill, the physical condition in which the body was found. And there are also things such as rigor mortis will set in earlier and be of shorter duration due to deaths by poisoning, strychnine poisoning, a death that is the result of violent convulsions, any kind of death by electrocution or lightning. Those types of deaths will bring on rigor sooner, and it will be of shorter duration. Now, there are also deaths that show us late onset of rigor mortis, and that happens in deaths like due to pneumonia or asphyxiation, particularly in hanging deaths. Carbon monoxide poisoning, arsenic, those kinds of death will delay the onset of rigor mortis. The next stage that that we will see is the decomposition process, and that is a well-known guide that we use to determine time of death in bodies that are not found for weeks or even months. So while rigor mortis, algor mortis, and liver mortis are all listed as different stages of decomposition, they all typically occur within 1 to 48 hours after death. So the later stages of decomposition start after the 48-hour window. So that's when we start to see putrefaction. And putrefaction is the predominant cause of tissue degeneration, and it's due to bacterial activity in the body. So under normal conditions, putrefaction follows a known sequence over the course of 4 to 10 days. In the first 24 hours, the abdomen will take on a greenish discoloration, and that will spread to the neck and shoulders and the head. Bloating follows, and it is due to an accumulation of gas, which is a byproduct of the action of bacteria within the body cavities and the skin. So this swelling, the bloating, begins in the face, where the features of your face, your tongue and your eyes will protrude. Next, your skin will begin to marble. Marbling is a greenish blue pattern of the blood vessels over the face, chest, abdomen, and extremities. So that's marbling. As the gases continue to accumulate in the body, the abdomen will swell and the skin will begin to blister. After that, we will typically see what we call skin and hair slippage, and the fingernails will begin to slough off. And so by this stage, the body has taken on a greenish black coloration, and the fluids of decomposition, which we call purge fluids, will begin to drain from the person's nose and mouth. This is often mistaken for bleeding, and so, but it's not. This purge fluid is due to extensive breakdown of the body tissue. And putrefaction, the whole putrefaction process can be accelerated when there is an excess of heat in the environment. And on the other hand, cooling of the body can slow the putrefaction process, and freezing of the body can stop it altogether. Let's talk about insect activity for a minute. Flies deposit eggs on dead animals, including humans, and they are what we call very well-tuned death detectors. An animal like a human that dies immediately begins to undergo chemical changes and produces chemicals that leak out into the environment. These chemicals are known as cadaverine and putrescine, and they are detected in even the tiniest concentrations by flies and other insects. And so if an animal the size of a human, like say a deer, were to drop dead in the forest, it's common to find flies laying eggs in the orifices of the carcass within 15 minutes of death or less. And it might take an hour or so in the average suburban household for that to happen if there had been an open window or an open door. With regard to maggots, the only way there would be insect activity in a body that was buried and then dug up and found to have maggots, which are fly larvae, that would only have happened if the larvae had hatched from eggs that were on the body before it was buried. So if a buried body is dug up and found to have maggots in it, then these larvae hatched from eggs that were on the body before it was buried. If the maggots are living, we can tell how long the body was likely buried if we consider the stage of development of the larvae and the temperature of the ground in which the person was buried. So it's complicated, but it does tell us a lot, the insect activity. Now, with regard to toxicology and the blood alcohol concentration, it's common knowledge that this is a result of, well, let me back up. The result of any analysis is only as good as the sample that is used to do the analysis. So, in a recent article written by a scientist, his name is Jim Wigmore, he found that over half of the post-mortem blood that is sampled, it is found to be, it's not sterile, it contains bacteria, such as yeast and fungi. And in addition, the post-mortem blood sugar glucose concentration can be 7 to 10 times greater than before in the blood than before death. So due to post-mortem fermentation, when a body is not kept cool after death, there can be a false positive blood alcohol report, which is up to 2.5 times the legal limit. That's it can be a false report. So another thing that could contribute to a false reading would be whether or not the deceased had taken any kind of aspirin or histamine 2 blockers like Zantac or Pepsin. These would inhibit gastric alcohol activity and cause elevated ethanol levels in the blood. So the estimation of blood alcohol concentration at the time of death from post-mortem samples is complicated by many factors, such as the quality of the sample, the location of the sample, the specimen collection technique, whether there's any kind of trauma contamination at the time of death, any kind of presence of microorganisms, the condition and location of the body, whether it was outdoors or indoors, the time of year, the temperature, the humidity in the environment. There are many factors that can affect the results of blood alcohol concentration. So all of these factors contribute to post-mortem production of ethanol from the microbial fermentation of natural substances such as glucose. So since the human body does not store glucose evenly within various fluids and tissues, post-mortem alcohol production is largely site dependent, and the choice of specimen for analysis is crucial to be able to distinguish between postmortem production and antemortem ingestion of alcohol. So relating the measured postmortem blood alcohol content with an equivalent antemortem blood alcohol content and making a statement about whether a person has ingested alcohol before death is full of pitfalls. The condition of the cadaver, and especially any advanced state of decomposition, putrefaction, can make the analysis and the interpretation of blood alcohol content pointless. And because under those conditions, some or all of the alcohol would have been produced after death. So what is the best specimen to use if we're trying to determine blood alcohol content? And that would be what we call vitreous fluid, vitreous humor. And that is the transparent fluid behind the lens of your eye, of your eyeball. And it is the best specimen to collect to determine ethanol in postmortem toxicology. And it helps us establish whether the deceased had consumed ethanol prior to death. So this watery fluid behind our lens of our eye is the ideal specimen for forensic analysis of alcohol because of the remoteness of the eye from the gut. Thus, it minimizes the risk of contamination from microorganisms from the digestive system. There are other autopsy specimens that are less common for analysis, such as bone marrow, brain tissue, muscle tissue, spinal fluids, and so it has been established for many years that blood alcohol levels at autopsy are valid up to 48 hours after death when solid protocols are observed in the collection and the storage of the sample. False blood alcohol levels can be generated in autopsy samples that are not correctly stored. And high blood alcohol levels may develop during putrefaction, and the levels can be up to 0.200%. And it does not necessarily indicate that alcohol was consumed prior to death. So we have to be able to ensure that the specimens were stored in containers that are appropriate for storage, and they should be glass containers. The method of transportation and storage and the security of the materials come into play. The cleanliness of the sampling equipment, and these things are necessary to avoid contamination of the samples. Specimens need to be stored at 39 degrees Fahrenheit before they are shipped to the lab. And chain of custody has to be documented and ensured so that the integrity of the sample can be well documented. So what I'm trying to say is evidence of skin slippage, bloating, discoloration, etc., give us strong indication of decomposition and putrefaction, which makes it all the more likely that any alcohol present is was produced post-mortem after death. So finding a post-mortem blood alcohol content of 200 milligrams per 100 milliliter or more would have been necessary to even suggest that some alcohol was ingested prior to death, even if the body was appreciably decomposed. Let's talk a little bit about coffin birth. Coffin birth, it's also known as postmortem fetal extrusion. And it is the expulsion of a non-viable fetus through the vaginal opening of a decomposing body of a pregnant female. And it is caused by the intra-abdominal gases that develop during the decomposition process. So coffin birth typically take place between 48 and 72 hours after death. So it's 2 to 3 days after the person dies that we will see coffin birth. So this tells us that in the case of Shanann, that she was deceased at least 2 to 3 days because she had experienced coffin birth. Let's talk about strangulation. Strangulation is usually defined as the application of compressing forces to a person's neck, where the force on the neck is other than the weight of the person's body. So in strangulation, there may be partial or complete obstruction or compression of all of the principal anatomical structures of the neck, including veins, arteries, airways, and nerves. So compression of the arteries in the neck is less common than venous occlusion, since the carotid arteries are largely obscured by the sternomastoid muscles. Direct pressure or manipulation of the carotid sinuses, which are located, they're the nerve endings just below your chin. If those nerve endings are compressed, the result can be what we call bradycardia or total cardiac arrest. So these carotid sinuses, this bundle of complex nerves located underneath our chin, can, when compressed, cause cardiac arrest. Now, the development of petechia in any kind of fatal neck compression depends on the duration, the consistency, and the intensity of the force that's applied to the neck. Petechia, it presents as little pinpoint, almost little red freckles that are visible in tissues and mucous membranes in the area of our neck, in the skin, in the conjunctiva of our eyes, in the sclera of our eyes, in our larynx, and in our oral mucosa. Petechia does not prove strangulation, and the absence of petechia does not disprove it. They are simply used as a marker of increased cephalic venous pressure. So if arterial vascular supply or venous return are completely obstructed, then petechia will not occur as blood is prevented from entering the tissue. If cardiac arrest occurs during compression of the neck, then petechial hemorrhage, which is often associated with relatively long periods of neck compression lasting more than 2 minutes, may not necessarily be present. Bruising of the neck occurs when the assailant's fingers grasp the person's neck. The bruises are usually circular, dark red or purple in color, and are typically 1 to 2 centimeters in size. And if the fingers slide over the skin, then we may see elongated marks on the neck. Abrasions on the neck, such as scratches, can be caused by fingernails. And it's important to note the fingernails can belong to the perpetrator or the victim. So, for instance, if the victim is being strangled and they reach up to their neck area to try to pry loose the hands that are strangling them, or the rope or whatever is causing the neck compression, then they themselves could scratch their own neck. So it's important to understand that that can happen. Internally in your neck, what we will typically see on autopsy is that the tissues of the neck are markedly what we call contused. Bleeding can be seen in the strat muscles, and if excessive force is applied, then we will see bleeding of the larynx as well. Now, asphyxia by smothering is caused by blocking the airway, so there's no air entering the lungs. And this happens when we simultaneously close off the person's nose and their mouth. Now, collapsed lung happens when air enters the pleural space, and in the pleural space is the area between the chest wall and the lung. And if it's a total collapsed lung, it's called a pneumothorax. And if only partial lung is affected, it's called, I'll say it slowly, it's atelectasis. And that occurs when the tiny air sacs within the lungs become deflated and possibly filled with alveolar fluid. So I think we'll stop here. That's been a lot of information for you to digest. I hope I have helped you get a clearer understanding of the processes, and I really appreciate you taking the time to watch my video. Thank you.